safety program presentation.
Good evening. So Ms. Juarez finds where my presentation is. I'll greet the board, Mr. President, members of the Governing Board and Cabinet. I am here this evening to share with you some information about the school safety program. And as I understand it, it is at the request of a member of the board, although I don't know which one. And I am hoping that the information that I have to share with you tonight will be a good place to start, inasmuch as we do not have any of our SROs or our JPOs available to answer your questions about the implementation of the program on school sites, because they're all off kind of for the summer, except I think one or two who are working in the morning to do some wake-up club things, but they're not available to us in the evening. So tonight I'm just going to kind of give you an overview, a little bit of history, let you know what the goals of the program are, talk to you a little bit about the officer roles and responsibilities, and give you a little bit of information about our district's participation. And if at any place along the way you'd like me to stop and answer some questions, I'll do so. Otherwise, I'll take questions at the end. You may know that this particular program was established by our legislature, and it was done so in 1994. It occurred before some of the really newsworthy occurrences in schools having to do with some school shootings and that kind of thing. Columbine in Colorado occurred in 1999. At the time that the legislature established this particular law, they were looking to focus on school safety as it related more toward violent behavior and the elimination of drugs. And it started off in a small way and then grew and became more sophisticated over time. So it began kind of small. It is a program that has specific expectations for training and for implementation and for evaluation. As I said, it has evolved over the years. Initially, for the first two-thirds of its time since 1994, school districts or schools that wanted to apply for a school safety grant applied every year. So you never knew from one year to the next whether you were going to have officers in your schools or you would not have officers in your schools. The last funding cycle, which will end at the conclusion of the 13-14 school year, they initiated a 3-year cycle. So now schools apply for a grant for a 3-year cycle, so they know that if they meet their goals and objectives, if they file an appropriate evaluation of their program activities for the year, they will have funding for the next year. The only exception to that would be if the legislature, for some reason or another, decided to decrease funding. And they have not done that during this cycle. The governor did talk a little bit about increasing funding, which was intended to be a match, but I have not seen that play out in legislation, and I'm not sure that they're going to be doing it.
I think in the current state budget there was actually a small, it was not what the governor had proposed, but I think there may have been a small bump in school safety, which I don't know if that necessarily meant to school resource officers.
Okay. It could have meant a number of things, as they do at the state level, focus on a number of school safety kinds of issues. So the grant does allow multiple officers at a school during the 3-year grant cycle. Most schools have only one officer. and it requires annual evaluations. The purpose, and I'm not going to read this to you, but the general purpose of the legislation at its inception was to contribute to safe school environments so that were conducive to teaching and learning. And that was their bottom line plan at the time, that it would be safe schools, good for teaching and learning. And good for not just students, but for staff and parents as well. The first goal of the school safety program is kind of a reiteration of what their purpose was. And so I won't read that to you. It's an orderly, purposeful environment and atmosphere conducive to teaching and learning. The second goal is all around the implementation of law-related education programs, and that comprises a good part of what our school resource officers do in our schools. They are required to teach law-related education. There are a number of partners in this program, and they range from the Legislative Oversight Committee to the Department of Ed, to the district who has administrative oversight responsibility, to school administration who is concerned with the implementation on the campus, and to the SROs and JPOs. The JPOs are juvenile probation officers, and the SROs are police officers. And each of those groups have a supervisor either out of the police department or out of the court system. So there are a lot of people involved in this particular program. You can see here a side-by-side kind of comparison of the roles and duties of the officers. As you can see, the SROs, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask about the JPOs. Are they only at sites that we have juvenile offenders that are?
No. That's a good question, though. You know, each school gets to determine whether it wants to have a police officer or a juvenile probation officer as their school safety officer. And they make that decision based on a variety of information and experience that they've had in the past with officers. They come from a little bit different place. The police officers, the school resource officers, are primarily concerned with enforcement and trained to enforce the law and to educate people about the enforcement of the law. Juvenile probation officers, on the other hand, receive some training and counseling of kids and some group activity work. So it depends upon what the campus decides it needs. So they decide what it is. So you can see that the SRO is a sworn law enforcement officer. They're a policeman who's able to carry out the law and enforce it. The JPO is an officer of the court. They both teach law-related education, 180 hours of law-related education a year. They need to be positive role models, and they need to be members of the school safety committee in all cases. So the positive role model is kind of an interesting role that they fulfill, because the procedures for this program encourages the officers to be active not only on the campus but in the community. They want these officers to get to know the community members, the parents, the teachers, and the students, so that they can really have an active part in keeping that community safe. It's really important to recognize and to know that that these folks are not in our schools primarily to enforce the law, nor as a JPO to monitor the probation of a student. They're primarily there to act as a school resource officer engaged in law-related education and the fulfillment of those requirements. It is only in emergencies or crises when they step out of their role as a school resource officer and into the role of a police officer, and now they can fulfill those duties. As an example, if a student is found to have violated some kind of a board policy or one of our requirements or our internal expectations for behavior, the school resource officer is hands off that. They're not a disciplinarian in the school. If, however, a student engages in an activity that violates the law, then the school resource officer might become engaged in what is going on with that activity and with that student. Did I see a question here?
I was just gonna ask, how much input does the actual school site, okay, so let's say you get the grant, you're going to get an SRO or a JPO in your school. How much say-so does that administrator have in who they get, or is it just like, okay, you're going to get Officer Smith in your school?
In general, you're going to get Officer Smith in your school unless you've had some experience with an officer in a previous year. For instance, we have one officer at Gateway, his name is Officer Cox, and he's been there a very long time. And they promise us they're not going to take him away, and we always ask, is Officer Cox coming back? But from time to time, the officers make a decision, a different career decision, want to do something differently, or they may want to move from an elementary setting to a high school setting, or they just may not, they may decide that they're going to be retiring now. Any number of things could happen. We don't get to pick the officers. However, we do, on a semi-annual basis, have input into an assessment of how well they are conducting and implementing their duties as an officer. And if at any time a school administrator is concerned about how well they're doing their job or have concerns about their behavior, sometimes absenteeism has been an issue, they can call the supervisor and have the supervisor come over and talk to them about that. And we have had, I think in our very long history with this program, an officer or two who has been asked to leave and we've had them replaced. But it's for a pretty significant kind of an issue because we want to work with them and help them be more what they need to be in our system.
So what kind of, you talked about checks and balances for making sure that their role is different as a campus SRO. What kind of training do they get so that they know that law enforcement isn't their primary role?
You know what, their training is extensive. As an example, at the end of the presentation and the PowerPoint, I've given you the URL so that you guys can log on to the ADE, and there's lots of information in there because I knew we would not have time to cover it all. They are required to attend training annually before they ever become a school resource officer and are placed in the school. There is extensive training. They have a supervisor on the police force or in the court system that meets with the building administrator at least twice a year and with the school resource officer numerous times during the course of the year, and does an actual police evaluation or a court evaluation on the individual. So they're highly trained. They really are highly trained individuals.
Great.
And the training is different, and in addition to that which they would receive for just being a police officer or and I don't mean that, not just a police officer, but in addition to their regular police training.
I missed, Ms. Burkhardt, what is the breakdown we have between JPOs versus SROs?
And we're going to get to that in
Okay,
just a minute. I do have that. I wanted to let you know a little bit of the background with Creighton. In the program, we started in the very early 90s, or in the late 90s, with Papago with Creighton and Papago were our first two schools. And by 2008, 2009, you can see that we have 3 JPOs and 5 SROs, and some schools had both. So we had a fairly large grant of over $600,000. By 2010-11, as the economy started to dive, this was one of the programs that the legislature began to reduce. Creighton was lucky because while it looks like we had a little over half of the funding we had in previous years, we still kept 5 officers, and that was very fortunate because most districts lost a lot of officers, and we did not have that experience. The major change in the program, as I said earlier, is that they've moved from an annual application, which is competitive, by the way, to a 3-year application, and they've tightened expectations for training and for evaluation. Current grantees, and we're talking 2012-13, there are 36 statewide, 20, and when I talk about a grantee, I'm talking about a school district, and they may have multiple schools within their application. There are 20 approved applications, 20 districts in the state in Maricopa County. Of those, 11 are elementary, 6 are unified, and 3 are high school districts. There are not too many high school districts because we don't have as many just high school districts here. Funding levels for the current year are a high of almost $900,000. And interestingly enough, that's in Paradise Valley, which was kind of a surprise to me. I thought, well, that's interesting. The low is in Buckeye, who has a part of an officer. Creighton this year had a little bit over $400,000. The recipients, and this is the answer to your question, Mr. Jewett, the recipients for this year's, for the 3-year grant cycle we're currently on, SROs are at Gateway, Kennedy, and Loma Linda, and JPOs are at Creighton and Papago. And once again, those are school choices. This is another interesting thing to think about and contemplate. In the spring of 2014, they will be letting applications for a new 3-year grant cycle, so everyone will have to reapply for another 3-year grant cycle. And if we do a really good job in our applications and collecting our data, and if we have a good track record, there is reason to believe that we will retain at least our 5 officers. And as I said, this is the URL for the Arizona Department of Education website. It has the Safe Schools manual. It has examples of the weekly logs that the officers have to complete, and it also has lists of some kinds of training, some of the training that they offer. So if you dig in that website, you can find out lots of information. I'm more than willing to take other questions if you have any.
So you said that, it's kind of luck of the draw who you get. So if somebody is retiring or decides to, like you said, move on, then it's up to the administrator, right, of the school site to reapply for the grant. Is that correct? Or it gets I think I heard you say somewhere in there that it was the school site's decision whether they wanted to apply for that or.
It is a school.
Okay.
It's a school site decision whether to apply for a grant or not. But if someone is moving on to another role in the police department or the court system, or is retiring and they do so during that 3-year cycle, they would automatically get another officer because their grant would have been approved. But at the end of the 3-year cycle, all of the schools will have to reapply. And others may want to. We may have other schools that may decide they want to apply as well.
So in the current round with the 5 that we have,
Right.
were there any of our schools that applied that were not awarded the grant?
Yes, there were. There were several, and they are not it's a competitive grant, so it's a point system, and the readers do not know the names of the schools, nor the district that's applying, and they do it according to a rubric. And so when we ask to look at the scores, they'll let you look at the composite, but not the individual. And we just had a couple of schools that lost some points and were not funded. Mackin was not funded. And I can't remember the Excellencia, Mackin and Excellencia, that would be right.
So in terms of this next round, since we presumably can hope to assume that the schools that were funded because they had high enough points, do we have a plan to have those leaders work in a bit more of a collaborative process to sort of either evaluate or vet the applications before they submit them in terms of our own internal evaluation?
We had a pretty good vetting process. We do that every year. Maybe it would be helpful for you to know just a little bit about the process that we use. We send the applications out to the schools so that they can look at them and think about whether they want to apply. Once they decide they want to apply, we have a training here at district office. We look at the applications of prior years so that they can have some idea about what has been funded in the past. And then I read every draft, and I send the drafts back to the schools with comments about, I think you need to increase the information here. You don't have enough data. This is confusing. It doesn't look like you've answered the question, those kinds of things. We can always get better at that. The degree to which a school is able and has the time and the personnel to do that well, it's a very competitive process because schools want these officers. So schools that really invest the time and effort and have the staff to invest the time and effort tend to do better. The other thing that plays into it is if a school has been a grantee and for some reason or another has not been able to fully implement the program that they've had, and now they're applying for a new grant and they don't have the data, part of the application is a report on how you've implemented your program and the success that you've had. If you've had reasons why that hasn't happened to the degree that you had hoped, to the readers, the reasons don't matter. All that matters is that you have not fully implemented it. So there are a number of things that you really have to be very aware of and cognizant of and think about as you're developing the grants. And we do a pretty, to have been a small elementary school district and have at one time had 8 officers, no other school district had that many. So we've done very well in this particular competition. It's just that it's highly competitive. And when you submit the application, it is submitted by the district, and inside the application are the applications from each school, so they can approve all of them, some of them, or none of them. And you may remember when they awarded this most current 3-year round, there were some school districts in the state that were very upset because they lost, I can recall Mesa, I think, lost 18 officers. And some of the other larger districts, because they tended to pull some officers out. And why that happened, I don't know. They just had X amount of dollars. They fund up to the amount of dollars they have available, and then they cut it off. Officers, it might be helpful to know that officer salary and benefit packages for these programs are ranging between about $75,000 and $82,000 a year. So every officer you get is taking that much money out of the pot for the next school.
Is that the same for cost of, as a JPO?
I looked at JPO salaries and SRO salaries. I think our JPOs are running about 75, the SROs are about 82. But what really matters is their length of service, because you're paying for, like an experienced teacher or administrator, we're paying for the experience that we get. So the less experience the salary is, the less more experience it's higher.
My understanding also is a difference between SROs and JPOs is that SROs are armed and JPOs are not. I don't know if you know.
That would be true.
Okay. I'm just looking up a little bit of something here from Children's Action Alliance, which, for full disclosure, is also my employer. But this is not a document I put together. It is a summary of changes in the state budget that was just signed by the governor yesterday compared to the current year budget that's ending. And for school safety program, which is, there's an increase of $3.6 million coming in 2014, provides a state matching grant to hire school resource officers and or JPOs, requires that 25% of funding be used for security hardware. So that's just a very, very cryptic summary, but there's a little bit of extra money. I also know that Scottsdale PD, Scottsdale Police Department, puts in additional funds. So in Scottsdale schools, there are some additional funds, and I know that after the Sandy Hook incident that they had put, I think, officers in every single school for a short time, which did raise some concerns because there were officers who were in schools who had, because they were funded by the city of Scottsdale and not part of this ABE
Had a different
program.
set of priorities.
Yes, they did not have the training. And that's, I think, one of the issues and controversies that's come up. I know that I have met and talked with the American Civil Liberties Union about this, and while they've raised a lot of concerns nationally, I could not find from them a single incident that they had of racial profiling or anything of that nature, of kind of students getting maybe improperly referred to courts. I couldn't find any such examples that were Arizona specific. So we found that in a number of other states, and I do have a fact sheet from them, which I can share with the administration of the board or whomever wants it. But one of the things that I think, to me, one of the concerns is that I know that there are, not all officers have the mental health first aid training, which is starting to come about, and Arizona is actually a leader in this. And there are many times officers respond in a way that they're trained, which is different than someone who maybe has clinical training may respond. And so there is an attempt to try to de-escalate situations by doing more of the mental health first aid and also provide interventions early on before things happen. So are you aware of whether or not that such training is something that our officers have?
I am not. However, we did attend a meeting that the Mayor of the City of Phoenix had, Mayor Stanton had, and the City of Phoenix is also looking at some other ways to get support into the schools, everything from having a room in a school site where the police officers can go to sit and do reports and then just kind of walk around the campuses, to trying to figure out how to help fund or get more support for these SROs. He did not really talk at that particular meeting about doing additional training in terms of the mental health and the way I did not hear about that. I do know that having had you read the summary of what the governor signed, what that would mean to a school district then is it would be a matching fund situation. So perhaps you would apply to the State Department for an SRO or a JPO through the school safety program, but you would have to pay for half of the salary. Most school districts, or many at least, are not going to be in a financial position to be able to do that. I can find out more about training from Ms. Collins, who's at the State Department and works with this program. And I'll find out a little bit more to see whether they're focusing on any mental health training for the
I
officers.
appreciate that.
I really will do that for you.
And my only other kind of question, concern is when we see suspension data and we see the referral source, are the SROs or JPOs ever the referral source that we see for suspensions, or is that always Creighton staff?
From my experience, which is extensive with this, I would say 99.9% of the time it's from Creighton staff.
I would be interested in if there's a way, if it ever is an SRO or a JPO, and just seeing that noted on our suspension report.
Given their scope of work and what they're expected to do in the system, the only time I can see that as even a viable possibility for them to be engaged in that kind of a referral would be in a situation where the child had broken the law, maybe brought a weapon to school, something of that nature, but they're not in the discipline business. That's not their role.
And if I could just add to that, I really don't, I said 99.9 just to cover myself, but referrals, from my experience, I've never seen one that's come from an SRO or a JPO. And even when a child does break a law, because of the relationship building that officer plays on that, very often, if we're required to call the police, we call the police. We don't go to the SRO and the JPO just because that relationship changes. And so we just make direct calls. when we get that. For
The
most of
guidance manual even says that. It says in situations where a student may have been suspected of or found to have broken a law, that the arresting officer should not be the SRO. The arresting officer should be some other police officer. And it's exactly for the reason that Dr. Bogner spoke to. It's all about relationship building and helping particularly young people in urban situations who may not have had the best experience or training about our law enforcement agencies to build that over time. And if they are seen as an enforcer of the law rather than someone that's there to engage them, to understand and to support them, then that relationship building will not occur. It will be much more difficult to develop.
Well, I think within our district, I've heard nothing but positive feedback on the SRO and JPO program. And while I understand the concern, especially in light of the Sandy Hook incident, there was, of course, a bit of hysteria for a while about arming campuses and talking about the SRO program as if it were a solution to everything, which maybe led some people to believe that this was a major arming of our campuses, and it's not. And so I really appreciate all that our SROs and JPOs do, and I appreciate, thank you, Ms. Burkhart, because I think it really speaks well, as someone who also writes grants for a living, when we have gotten this many grants funded. I think it speaks well for you and for everyone who writes grants that we've been able to maintain this many, considering the size of our district.
We work hard at it, and thank you so much
Thanks.
for your time this evening.
Okay, our next item, I forgot that I'm the president, I'm waiting for someone to yes, just revisit the meet and confer.